Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's October 3, 2020, and today we are speaking about masculinity and ceasefires among the Naga people with Matt Wilkinson, a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales, who also works in equity pathways at the Australian Catholic University. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Luke.
Thanks for coming on the show. The Naga population is something like 2 million, and these people mostly live in the regions known as Naga Land in India and the Naga Self-Administered Zone in Myanmar. And these two administrative polities share a land border if you look at it on the map. Now, as we both know, and listeners know, Myanmar is a really culturally diverse country, and anyone living in the larger cities and towns will eventually meet people identifying as Shan or Pa'o or Chin or Kachin or Lisu, far away from their home villages. But it's really rare to meet a Naga person in Myanmar. So, Matt, this really simple first question is, before we discuss all about your PhD, just who are the Naga?
Naga, and the term Naga is very interesting, and it's a somewhat contested term. And the story of Naga encompasses geography, it encompasses tea, it encompasses a colonial history that has kept a population of people separate from the communities around them for over a century. So Naga is a designation for a collection of tribes who live on the borderlands of India and Myanmar. There are 17 Naga tribes recognized as living in India, and there are 10 recognized as living across the border in Myanmar. Although those numbers of tribes are contested, and there's a lot of disagreement about what actually makes a Naga tribe, who is a Naga tribe. So some of the larger tribes that listeners might have heard of are the Konyak tribe in the north of Nagaland, the Angami in the south, the Chak in the east, and the Lotha in the west. These tribes have come to settle in the highlands that today form this borderland between India and Myanmar. And it's part of a larger highland area that Willem van Schendel has referred to as Zomia. Some of these groups have, if you trace them back far enough, come from the Yangtze Kiang and Hoang Ho rivers in southwest China. Others come from further afar. So in 645 AD, Huang Sang, who was a Chinese pilgrim who visited Assam in northeast India near Nagaland, noted that the communities in Nagaland have similarities to the Man people in southwest China. And other tribes seem to be able to trace their lineage back to the kingdom of Mrok-U, which is in present-day Myanmar on the coast. So all of these groups have come uphill into what is present-day Nagaland, and today are referred to as the Naga tribes. The space itself is marked by rugged and difficult to traverse territory. So it's a place that states have traditionally struggled to establish themselves. It's hard to bring an army into these areas. It's hard to build roads. It's expensive and difficult to bring supplies. And these groups have thrived in this area because of it. They've come to flee taxes and corvée labor. They've come to escape from diseases. They've come to escape warfare and collapsing states, and to find fertile and safe land. As James Scott calls it, it's a shatter zone. Within Nagaland, and since settling, these tribes have also been at war with each other. Headhunting was practiced among several of these tribes well into the 20th century. They are traditionally patriarchal societies where men exclusively are decision makers in many tribes, and women are often barred from entering areas where they make decisions, and in some cases entering a particular distance of these areas. So Nagaland as we know it today more or less began or has its roots in the Burmese invasion of Assam in 1817. So the British pushed the Burmese out of Assam, took control of Assam in 1826, and began planting tea in the Assam Valley, which was the first time that the British controlled tea plantations from about 1838. These tea plantations expanded in the Assam Valley, reaching the Naga foothills, and Naga communities began raiding tea plantations for profit. This required the British to respond by marching into the Naga Hills in a series of expeditions and trying to take control of that area. They never really gained complete control over what is Nagaland today. It's a difficult area to control. Linguistically, it's very diverse. Politically, it's very diverse. And the British had few resources in the area. They were able to convert most Nagas to Christianity, and besides that, largely left Naga communities to their own devices. It was very ad hoc governance. In a nutshell, Naga communities are culturally, linguistically, and physically distinct from the communities in the plains in India and in Myanmar that surround them. And these differences have been preserved in many ways and formalized under the colonial regime and are still very visible today. So the story of Naga is really one of difference, of isolation, and of finding a geographic space that preserves that difference.
As you've mentioned, though, the Naga are not alone in this story of moving to the uplands, resisting state control, being identified in relation to the people in the lowlands and their political organisations. There are people living in the mountains all around the Naga who don't call themselves Naga and speak different languages. So I want to know about what's culturally idiosyncratic and unique about the Naga in relation to the other highland peoples of Zomia. Is it hugely linguistic, or is it mostly religious? Are they very Christian or nominally Christian?
That is a huge question, one that's controversial, one that's been violently contested, and one that I can only really do a small amount of justice to. So if we're talking about religion, Naga communities are leaning towards Baptist and evangelical brands of Christianity, and it's a very Christian state. On India's census, the state of Nagaland is 98% Christian, so Christianity has become a part of Naga identity. Linguistically, there is a Naga language, which is a mix of Assamese and English and Hindi and some other local dialects. But at the village level, there are dozens of different languages which are spoken in Nagaland, and many of them are unintelligible to each other. What currently distinguishes the Naga community from other highland communities surrounding them are a history of differential treatment under colonial authorities, which also took place in other communities though, but which definitely designated a Naga identity, gave it a space, and gave these people a shared brand or an umbrella term to put themselves under. A written history, which was introduced to the Naga Hills by colonial authorities, and a history of violent treatment by the post-colonial Indian state, one that encompasses decades of human rights abuses, one that has in many senses unified Naga communities as an independence push against the Indian state. And that's also happened in other highland areas. The Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh have hosted similar conflicts where various tribal groups have united to resist and push against the state. So Naga today is an outcome of a number of constructions and historical circumstances that have come together to unite disparate tribes in a very specific highland on the border of India and Myanmar.
This may seem a little bit odd, but how about nakedness? The number one stereotype that I encounter in the tea shops and the beer shops of Yangon and Mandalay and the big cities in Myanmar, and even in some places further afield, is that Naga people in Myanmar don't wear clothes. Where does this myth come from? And is there any kind of objective truth to it?
The idea of the naked Naga is something that has roots in pre-colonial ideas about barbarians at the hills and highland peoples being different to lowland state-based peoples. It's one that also encompasses ideas of cannibalism, of being at a lower state of evolution than other people. It's something that that James Scott talks about in his excellent book, The Art of Not Being Governed a lot. And it's also something that Wilhelm van Schendel discusses directly in a very, very interesting article called Photographing the Naked Mru, which is based in Bangladesh. The idea that Nagas are naked comes from anxieties of pre-colonial states and pre-colonial people about groups who live beyond their reach. It's a construction that designates the state as a zone of order and sensibility, and the frontier, or the places that the state is struggling to reach out to, as dangerous, as unruly, as uncooked, in the case of the Chinese state. So the naked Naga is a pre-colonial trope, which was then played upon by colonial anthropologists to exploit this idea of a savage pre-colonial barbarian in these places. It is a very loaded construct. It's one that has very little truth to it. In some tourist discourses, especially today, it's one that reappears and that is exploited. And it's one that a lot of these communities often themselves will exploit because there's employment to be made in that. But I guarantee you, if you go to the state of Nagaland, not only will you see people dressed in clothes, but Nagas today are actually quite famous, as well as other groups in Northeast India, as fashion-forward people. And so high fashion has entered the Naga area, mostly because there's much more identification with Southeast Asia and South Korea especially, which has made the politics of clothing in Nagaland and in these other highland areas really, really interesting and really current.
Thanks for that great explanation, Matt. And keeping with this theme of stereotypes and perceptions from the centre, I think it's safe to say that the majority population in India looks to the northeast and uses a discourse of conflict and instability. And people think that Nagaland is a place rife and torn by conflict. Now, ceasefires are really important to your research, but before we talk about the ceasefires, can we talk a little bit about these conflicts that have been going on in Nagaland and how they've transformed to lower intensity in recent years?
Well, Nagaland being a part of Northeast India, Northeast India has a long history of conflict with the Indian state and the Indian center. It is geographically distant from Delhi especially. It is geographically different, so there's different territory, and with that, they practice different forms of agriculture. And so these conflicts have deep histories in roots of cultural difference and differential treatment by the state. Colonial administrators used a number of policies, in particular the inner line policy, to border off these highland regions from the rest of India, to isolate them and to prevent people coming up into the hills and people from the hills going down into the plains in order to preserve some sort of an order. When India achieved independence in 1947, a lot of these communities expected varying degrees of independence and autonomy like this to continue, to be largely left to their own devices, to be allowed to practice their own customary laws. And Naga communities voiced some of the earliest and loudest calls for this independence, going back to the 1920s. This independence was then refuted by Indian authorities, and the Naga independence push increased its agitations and became more and more violent. By 1956, the Naga National Council, which was the peak independence body at the time, led by A.J. Pizzo, had raised an army in Tuen Sum in the east of Nagaland and declared an independent Naga republic. Following that, India militarized the Naga Hills in a militarization that's ongoing. The groups were not only agitating for independence, they were agitating for an alternative map of Nagaland, which they called Naga Men. And that map encompasses areas where other Naga communities reside in other Indian states, such as Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, and Manipur, and across India's border with Myanmar. So India's militarized response was stamping out a demand for an alternative independent country, really, in the form of Nagaland. In this response, exceptional laws were created, in particular the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which grants Indian paramilitaries stationed in Nagaland exceptional rights to act with almost complete impunity in terms of shooting people to kill, detaining and arresting people without warrant. It largely suspends human rights where it's applied. So the conflict emerged from difference and demands for independence, was responded to with militarization and exceptional laws. And then throughout the 1970s and 1980s, disintegrated. So Naga guerrilla fighters or insurgents responding to extreme human rights abuses by Indian armed forces then split themselves along ideological and often tribal lines. In 1980, the NNC broke into the NNC and a group called the National Socialist Council of Nagaland. And in 1989, the NSCN, National Socialist Council of Nagaland, split into two warring factions, one called the NSCN-IM for Isaac Morvai, their leadership, and one called the NSCN-K for Kongro Konyak, their leader. These groups still exist today, are the two largest insurgent groups in Nagaland at present, and are in conflict with each other. So this all changed in the early 1990s. India was liberalizing, connections to Asia were becoming especially important, and India's northeast was the highway to Asia and the highway to creating an export-oriented economy that would serve the needs of the subcontinent. So resolving these conflicts became very urgent and gained a lot of weight. In 1997, after prolonged negotiation, the NSCN-IM signed a ceasefire with the Indian state, and in 2001, the NSCN-K signed an almost identical ceasefire. This leaves Nagaland in its current predicament. The state is in ceasefire. However, Indian paramilitaries are still stationed in Nagaland. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which grants these paramilitaries almost complete autonomy to function as they wish, still applies. Naga nationalist groups have continued to split into warring factions, which fight each other and occasionally fight the Indian armed forces, breaking ceasefires and then repairing ceasefires and then breaking ceasefires and then repairing ceasefires. And in the middle of all of this is the Naga community and the general public, who pay the greatest price. Nagaland's borders continue to be contested by these groups, and the borders are an issue because Naga nationalist groups can flee across the border with Myanmar, where the Indian armed forces essentially can't reach them. At the same time, though, Nagaland is opening up. The state's liberalizing. Ceasefires signal that conflict is at least coming to a close, if at all slowly. They signal that stability is coming to the state and that the state's becoming fertile for industry, for extraction projects, for commercial expansion. This change is really visible in Nagaland's capital, Kohima. The city is urbanizing at an astronomical rate. And the same is happening in the commercial hub in the largest city, Dimapur. So the current predicament really is one of a tense ceasefire between the government of India and various Naga insurgent groups, alongside liberalization and economic growth. It's a very interesting case. It's a very unusual case, but it's also a case that mirrors other frontier areas that are coming out of conflict.
So you argue in your recently submitted thesis that these ceasefires in Nagaland challenge conflict-informed masculine norms that portray Naga men as the guardians of Naga territory, culture, and society. What do you mean by this? What are some tangible examples of these norms? And how have the ceasefires challenged them? I mean, surely ceasefires are always a good thing.
That's one way of looking at them, for sure. And really my fascination with ceasefires comes from looking at the ways that they've failed and the ways that they create new forms of insecurity. So in terms of ceasefire in Nagaland affecting masculinity, tangible examples are really hard to see. It's not like there are people who explicitly say, oh, Naga masculinity is informed by conflict and insurgency and ceasefire in these ways. What we need to remember, though, is that under colonial administration and reaching further back than before colonialism, Nagas and other highland tribals were portrayed as violent warriors, as savage people, as barbarians. And in some ways, these portrayals were beneficial. They encouraged policies that protected their land and handed customary institutions a lot more power in these areas. So they encouraged autonomy. And the colonial framework fed into these ideas of Naga men as fierce warriors, as hot-headed men, as bloodthirsty people, and as natural fighters. Anthropology formalized that. It put it into words. It gave people a history from the colonizer's perspective. And this continues to be a trope that's revisited in Naga tourism initiatives especially, and continues to inform popular discourse of the region as an area where savage tribal people live, where warlike people live. So conflict also played a role in this. Naga nationalist groups drew heavily from a language that masculinized conflict and linked taking part in Nagaland's independence struggle to men's roles as guardians of the Naga community, to men's roles as fighters and warriors. What I look at in my thesis is how the changes that have happened in Nagaland since ceasefire was signed and since the conflict has begun to close challenges these roles. So insurgent conflict is becoming an area that less and less men take part in, and overall less and less Nagas support and want to be involved with. Engaging with the Naga underground or Naga nationalist groups is associated with a lot more violence within the Naga community. Naga nationalists, at least colloquially, are often suspected to be drug addicts or alcoholics or degenerates who can't find work anywhere else. Now, in my conversations with various groups in Nagaland, I've actually found that these groups are very hostile towards drug addiction and drug use and alcohol abuse. But nonetheless, these stereotypes have emerged and have a huge role in the way people understand insurgency and nationalism in the state. So ceasefire and the changes that come since ceasefire have encouraged an alternative script for Naga men, one that is less attached to armed conflict and it's more attached to liberal norms such as finding employment, getting an education, taking part in religious services and being a part of a post-conflict community.
Right, and these changes in the state have expanded the space for women's economic empowerment, you say, granting Naga women new forms of independence. But then at the same time, Naga men feel marginalised and threatened by similar social political changes, which results in what you call a patriarchal backlash. So what does that mean, patriarchal backlash, and how does that work?
So as Nagaland opens up, as the state's economy grows in the wake of conflict, as new people come to the frontier to exploit new opportunities, and as Nagas leave Nagaland to go to other parts of India and the world, Naga women especially have taken advantage of these opportunities. I need to make it very clear though, Nagaland is a patriarchy. Women do not enjoy the same rights in the Naga community as Naga men do. They do not have the same rights to inherit Naga ancestral land. They do not have the same rights to take part in traditional customary decision-making. And they are not looked upon traditionally as having the same roles as Naga men. A term that I've heard often in my fieldwork is equality as tradition. That is equal but different roles in the Naga community. Let me also make it clear that Naga women have always worked. That work's often involved farm work and manual labor, but in light of recent changes, more and more Naga women are exercising a lot more agency and independence in their lives. Real jobs have traditionally been thought of in Nagaland as government jobs because they're quite secure. Growing up in a lot of communities in Nagaland, especially for men, involves getting a real job working for the government. And in some ways, this culture has created a space in the private sector for women to find gainful employment, for women to get educated and become more independent. This occurs alongside other forms of independence and empowerment. So Naga women are now more likely to access higher education, and many leave Nagaland to go to larger Indian cities to study and to work. And in Nagaland, a large population of men are threatened by this. So the patriarchal backlash involves efforts by several Naga elites and groups of men in Nagaland to maintain conservative gender norms through sabotaging women's efforts to gain independence and empowerment, often utilizing a discourse of preserving Indigenous tradition and preserving and protecting the Naga identity. One of my informants, his name I've given him is Isaac. Isaac's a middle-aged Naga man who lives in a large town in Nagaland. He lives in his mother's house. All of his family identify him as an alcoholic, and he hasn't worked in about a decade. And one day I asked him about Naga women, about inheritance, and about what gender actually means in a practical sense in Nagaland. And he told me that the younger people, they're educated now, they've left the state. I'm reading from his quote and I'm paraphrasing him. They go outside to Bangalore, to Delhi, to Dubai, to Europe, Australia, and they see how it all is there. They see these things that are different to the village and they're different from our customs. And they want that development because they think that outside is better. They don't want old men in customary institutions telling them what to do. But also, this is tradition. This is who we are as Nagas. They need to respect that. They need to respect the elders. It's what people have fought for. It's the rights that they've fought for. He's saying this in his house, which is his property. Yes, my mother lives here, but my father left this to me as a Naga man. I have to keep this for the future. The man and the woman have roles to play, and the man here is to guard for the future, as he's pointing at the linoleum floor. That's what younger people don't understand. They want it all now, and they don't understand that it's about the future and it's about the past. So Nagaland's patriarchal backlash is about preserving an idea of a pure and traditional Naga society, one that's marked by very rigid and very strict gender roles that have a base in community, in identity, in the physical land itself. And the Naga men who feel threatened by Naga women taking a bigger role in community and transgressing their traditional roles and becoming more empowered and agitating their own land and agitating to have a seat at the decision-making table, especially in customary institutions. This is the group that I'm really interested in.
And as the state has opened up, as you've said, more regional political issues have come to the fore. So what is the IBI menace, as it is called, and how is it employed by Naga men to justify their dominance of public space and politics in the state?
The IBI menace. This is something that I've encountered since I've started coming to Nagaland in 2012. There's so much graffiti about the IBI menace. There's so much talk about the IBI menace. So IBI refers to illegal Bangladeshi immigrant. In the wake of conflict, Nagaland's economy is, of course, expanded very quickly. New construction's taking place, new industries are growing, although quite slowly. And Nagaland is overall experiencing this transition from being a very insecure, very out-of-the-way place to being slightly more stable, slightly more on the map, slightly less out of the way. And this has attracted a lot of migrants from the neighboring Indian state Assam, a lot of migrants from Manipur, not so many migrants from Myanmar, but migrants from distant states in India like Bihar, and especially migrants from Bangladesh. Many of these migrants work in highly visible parts of the economy. For example, truck drivers, delivery workers, running food stalls on the side of the street, working on building sites. If you're walking around the street, you will see the migrants and people who look like Bangladeshi migrants doing the footwork. And this has fed an anxiety that outsiders are taking over Nagaland. People see them everywhere. People see them working in a state where a lot of young Nagas still struggle to find work. There is a fear among a lot of Nagas that this migration will turn them into a minority in their own state. And this fear is rooted in what's happened in other parts of Northeast India, in particular in Tripura, which is often quoted as a worst case scenario. So Tripura is a state where there has been a demographic shift and where Bangladeshi migrants and the children of Bangladeshi migrants constitute a large proportion of the population now. And the fear is that that is happening in Nagaland. This has encouraged a push to preserve conservative Naga political and social norms, to resist the outsiders. And in terms of masculinity, that means maintaining men's exclusive roles in politics and decision-making, branding anyone who wants to upset those roles and upset that idea of a traditional Naga social order as a traitor or as anti-Naga. And especially it involves policing the relationships of Naga women so that outsiders and IBIs especially can't breed or marry their way into the Naga community and dilute Naga bloodlines.
And how much of this has to do with religion? I know that in Myanmar, famously, and in Assam, and I'm guessing other areas around there, Islam plays a really fundamental role in these anxieties about belonging and who belongs in the nation or the state. So how important a factor is that in Nagaland?
A huge factor. Nagaland is a very Christian state. The Naga community is a Christian community. And migrants from other parts of India and from Bangladesh, of course, are Hindus and Muslims. Compounding that is the fact that religion is highly visible. So Dimapur, for example, has a large population of Muslim migrants. Many of these people have lived there for over 100 years. They have mosques, they have shops that cater to Indian tastes and norms, they have halal restaurants, they practice Hindu and Muslim festivals in the parts of Dimapur where there are more Indians and more Bangladeshi migrants, such as Marwari Party, which is where the Marwari traders have traditionally lived. So from the perspective of a lot of Naga men, not only does it look like outsiders are coming in and taking over the economy in their state and demographically threatening them, it feels like it is a religious face-off between a conservative Baptist Christian community and communities from the plains who are either Hindu or Muslim, who have different diets, who look different, speak different languages, hold different norms around gender and clothing and social etiquette. While there's an obsession among a lot of especially older Naga men and Naga elites that these IBIs in particular are coming into the state and simultaneously are unhygienic, stereotypically, are violent and rapists. And yet at the same time, there's also a fear that they are seductive and that they're seducing and romancing their way into the Naga community and marrying Naga women and thereby having children that are half Naga and half Bangladeshi and breeding out the Naga community, which gives them access to all sorts of land rights and very complicated things that I don't think we need to go over. While there's that fear, the fear of Naga women marrying IBIs, there's very little discussion of Naga men marrying Bangladeshi or Indian women, really not much at all. So there is also a double standard.
And on the Naga women, I mean, what did they think about the IBI menace? Are they out there graffitiing IBI menace on all of the walls? Given the changes that they've had in their social, political, economic life since the opening up of the state that you've detailed, have they recognised that a lot of the people that they're serving in their shops, for example, are not Naga? And what do they think about the IBI menace?
Well, that's very interesting. And before I forget the name, this is something that's actually discussed by a Naga scholar called Temsula Au in a narrative she wrote called A Terrible Matriarchy. Now, the IBI menace is a discourse that is led largely by Naga men. It's a highly gendered discourse, but that doesn't mean that Naga women don't also take part in this. Rigid gender roles in the Naga community are linked to ideas of indigeneity and of preserving a snapshot or an idea of Naga culture as pure, as right. So it's not as if Naga women or some Naga women don't also play a role in recreating those ideas and of resisting the IBI menace, although men are much more visible in that. So the IBI menace is something that is highly gendered, but is not gender exclusive. And so, you know, especially, and I mean, Temsula Au can do this a lot more justice than I can, but many Naga women elites and empowered Naga women are resistant to the idea of younger Naga women, for instance, going to large Indian cities and mixing with non-Naga men, or to the idea of Naga women within Nagaland mixing with migrant communities.
All right, now we've sort of spoken a lot about things that are particular to the state of Nagaland in India. And now to finish up, I think we should branch out and talk a little bit about the self-administered zone on the Myanmar side. So that is, although getting more diverse and does have some Burma and other communities there, it is primarily still mostly Naga. It has terrible infrastructure, terrible connections to the Myanmar state. They only got their first bridge over the Chinwin last year, I think it was. So given this huge demographic, technological, economic connectivity disparity between the two sides of the border, I wonder how people in the state of Nagaland perceive their cousins, close or distant, across the border in the self-administered zone. And given that it remains less connected and more Naga demographically, is the eastern side at all idealised by those who live in the state of Nagaland? What are the cultural notions associated with being on the east and on the western sides of the border?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this because this is something that I found so interesting traveling around Nagaland. While, as I went over before, Naga identity is actually the term Naga is an umbrella term for a number of tribes, many of which have histories of hostility between each other and are very different from each other, even though together they're very, very distinct from the communities in the plains. There is a divide between a lot of Nagas in the Indian part of Nagaland called Western Nagaland and the Eastern Naga Hills District, which is the east side of the state, and in some senses extends to Naga territories in Myanmar. The idea is that the western portion of the state of Nagaland has enjoyed a lot more development. Dimapur, the largest city and the commercial hub, is in the west. Kohima, the capital, is in the west. The east is far less better serviced. The roads are terrible. And during the rain seasons, a lot of them are impassable, which blocks large portions of the state effectively off from the rest of the world. And that poor service, as you mentioned, continues across the Myanmar border. This has fed an idea that people in the east of Nagaland, and I'm speaking very broadly, and I'm speaking as a white male anthropologist traveling in Northeast India, but this has spread encouraged an idea that Nagas from the West are rough cut, are less educated, are poorer. The term rednecks or yokels or hicks might be something that we can identify a little bit more with, or bogans in Australia, for example. It's a cultural thing. It is not yet an issue. However, there are agitations in the Eastern Naga Hills among several groups to separate and to form their own Eastern Naga Hills district state, which revolve around meeting needs that are largely unique to the East, surrounding servicing and infrastructure and roads. So there's less of a longing for a traditional way of life, for lack of a better term, and that's a terrible way to put it, but there's less of a longing to go east. And more of it is about the east is the undeveloped poor part of Nagaland, and the west is developing, where, building roads and having jobs and we're more active and involved in the world. It's a little bit classist.
I see. Do you have anything else, anything important that you want to add before we get to recommendations?
I think the most important thing to say is that this research, yours and mine and other research as an anthropologist in Northeast India, I can really only speak for the Northeast. But for instance, the work of Wilhelm van Schendel in Bangladesh, the work of Professor Duncan McDouey-Ra in Manipur, the work of Dolly Kikon in Nagaland, for example. And I'm sure I'm leaving out a lot of excellent names. Bengt Carlson is absolutely amazing. There's a temptation to think that our work is localized, that what I'm looking at in Nagaland, for instance, is a very specific case of an area that is changing in ways that can't be generalized. I think it would be a mistake to assume that this work is localized, though. One of the problems that we face almost everywhere is the idea that an issue in one area, whether it's liberalization and the complications that come with it, is specific to that area. And that takes away from a larger debate revolving things such as, well, what is liberalization and how does it empower some people and marginalize or leave behind other people? So in terms of what I want my research in Nagaland to speak to, I think Nagaland can serve as a looking glass for changes that take place in the wake of conflict and in the wake of liberalization everywhere. Are there lessons that we can draw from Nagaland's post-conflict experience that we can then apply to Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or the Balkans or Northeast Ireland? We're not looking at a space. We're looking at things that happen in a space. And I think that's something very important to get across.
All right. Now, we always finish by asking our guests for a recommendation, which can be anything, as long as it is to do with Myanmar. Did you bring along anything today? It could be a book or a movie or a travel destination.
Now, I've only recently ventured to Myanmar and I absolutely fell in love with the place. And I fell in love with 99 Shah noodles in downtown Yangon, especially. I've eaten so much there. Do go eat at 99 Shah noodles. Go and stay at downtown 15th Street in Yangon, which is an excellent family-run hotel, and they'll take good care of you. In terms of reading and resources, my introduction to Myanmar actually was a few years ago with the book by Thant Nguyen U, The Making of Modern Burma. I think it provides a really, really good history from a really interesting perspective. In terms of some other things that have influenced me and that I'd really recommend, they're less Myanmar specific, but they still, especially if we're talking about highland communities, they're still very relevant, are Arnab Dewan's 2012 film, Life is Still Not Ours, which is about the conflict in the Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh. The film Life is Still Not Ours discusses the complex politics that are taking place in the CHT, and I think it can speak to a lot of other complex highland politics. The other resource I'd recommend is a classic, James C. Scott's 2009 book, The Art of Not Being Governed, an anarchist history of upland Southeast Asia. It's a book that from very early on has influenced me to a huge degree. I'll buy a copy, leave it on a bus, buy a copy, leave it on a plane. I don't know how many copies I've gone through. So those are my four recommendations. Go to Yangon, eat at 99 Shah noodles, read The Making of Modern Burma by Thant Nguyen U, watch Arnab Dewan's Life is Still Not Ours, and read James Scott's The Art of Not Being Governed.
Thanks, Matt. A great bunch of recommendations. And cheers again for coming on Myanmar Musings and talking all about the Naga with us.
Oh, thank you very much, Luke. This has been an absolute pleasure.